Hi, I'm Rick,
I'm Stephanie, Rick's wife.
and we have been married 36 years now.
Correct.
37, actually, this month.
No, in June.
In June, excuse me.
This is May.
This is May. So when Stephanie and I met, I was already a practicing sex addict. She didn't know it. We met at a church retreat up at Paladura Canyon close to Amarillo, Texas. And she was living in Amarillo at that point and had joined my small group at that particular church retreat. And we were actually having a competition, as they're apt to do at a college retreat, between different groups. And Stephanie was in my group. And what I remembered was she was 20 for 20 from the free throw line when we were doing our competition. And I went, holy smoke. We won the competition because of her. And I said, how in the world do you do that? And she said, well, there's never an excuse to miss a free throw. And at that point, I probably should have run. I had no idea what that meant. But she came with her boyfriend of 3 years, John. And I didn't like him from the second I met him. I didn't think he was the right person for her. I was pretty sure. And in fact, John made the serious mistake of going to bed Saturday night, and I stayed in the mess hall with her and played my guitar, trying to impress her. But the retreat was over, and she went back to Amarillo, and I went back to Lubbock, where I was living and working at that time. But that night, when I got home, I got a message from somebody I was supposed to be doing an event with the next weekend, and they had canceled. And I thought, hey, I'm going to call Stephanie and ask her to go to this event. So I got on the phone, gave her a call. She answered the phone, and I said, hey, Stephanie, this is Rick. Would you be willing to go to this event with me this next weekend? And she said, well, John's in the living room, and he just asked me to marry him, and I feel like I need to give him an answer first.
Well, that was before answering machines. So if your phone rang, you answered it. It didn't matter if somebody had just asked you to marry him. You just didn't let the phone ring. So I answered the phone, and it was Rick. But I just felt like I needed to give John an answer before I gave Rick an answer. And so I told Rick I'd talk to him on Wednesday.
So I called her back on Wednesday, and she said she could go. And I said, of course, that means you told John no, right? And she said, yeah. And so that's how our relationship began. But I think with us, we knew there were problems, or I knew there were problems long before we even got married. I remember when I proposed to Stephanie, we met in October, correct? And then I proposed in December. And the second I said, will you marry me, I had a panic attack and said, whoa, 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 don't give me an answer. And so I actually withdrew my proposal. And it took me probably another 4 weeks before I was able to get the nerve up. But I think for me that probably revealed a problem with intimacy impairment on my part. But I was scared to death to be in a relationship, largely because I had been acting out for years prior to being married, and I certainly wasn't going to be honest with Stephanie about my acting out behavior. Met in October, and we got married in June of 1978.
Right.
June 24th. And I think in August I took a trip, and that was probably the first time I picked up on my grooming behaviors again with someone. I was flirting with someone pretty heavily. And personally, I thought when we got married that I would be able to substitute what I would call my addiction sex or bad sex for good sex. But I found out quickly that all I'd really done is added to my sexual repertoire. Now I had marital sex and I had my extramarital sex. It's just that one didn't substitute for the other because they were very different. And the way I kept all of that secret through the years was by certain rules I lived by, such as you don't dig the latrine too close to the mess tin. I just made sure that my acting out was over here, where I would be grooming and flirting with other people, and the pornography, the masturbation. I kept everything very hidden.
He did, very hidden.
And Finally, about 6 years into the marriage, I got into an affair with Stephanie's best friend and my best friend's wife. And at first, for me, it was really important. Once it got going, I really wanted to break that thing off. Now, up to that point, my acting out had never been relational. It was much more addictive in nature. It was really just about sex. It wasn't about relationship. This one, actually, though, for the first time became an entangled relationship. And what I discovered was I was totally incapable of breaking that one off. And at that point, I moved into some pretty deep despair.
I began to see some signs that something was not right between them in their relationship. And it seemed like he was flirting with her. It seemed like she was flirting with him. And I actually confronted him with it. And as all good adulterers, he was also a good liar. And he assured me that there was nothing going on. And I asked him, I said, well, do you have a crush on her? Thinking that, maybe that's all it was. And he said, no, we're just friends. Just friends.
I knew that I couldn't keep it hidden. It was just way too complicated. And she was also emotionally involved with me. Neither of us seemed capable of stopping. We tried, and that wasn't going to happen. And so once I decided that we couldn't stop it, for me, honesty really was never an option. My image was way too important to me. I was a leader at our church. We had a Bible study in our home. I was doing really well professionally, and I didn't want to blow all of that and lose my family, but I just didn't want to be a disappointment. I always came up with the term for bad. I just had this fear of being a disappointment, and I lived that way. And by eliminating the option of honesty, the only other solution I could think of is that somebody needed to die. I mean, it could be me, it could be Stephanie, it could be the other person, but there was no way out of the triangle short of death. So we go on a church retreat on the covenant of marriage. And we were sharing a room with the lady I was actually having the affair with. Of course, Stephanie still
and her husband.
And her husband, of course. At that point, I was just going, man, this is so awkward and weird, and I just was living in fear that something would happen. In fact, I remember when we were skiing, I tried to ski through the trees as much as I could, hoping somehow, going at breakneck speed, that I'd hit something. But probably some of the best skiing I've ever done in my life, I was incapable of even hitting a tree and dying. And the night's lecture, first night, was on covenant, and I had a vision. I didn't even believe in visions at that point, but I suddenly found myself sitting in a movie theater all by myself, and on the right side of the screen, what was showing was this incredible light. It was literally the love of God. I think it was Jesus himself, but this light was just enveloping me. It was just pure love and holiness. It was unbelievable. I'd never felt anything like it. And then on the left side of the screen, what was showing was the holiness of Rick. And it was so black, literally it was just sucking light into it. And I turned over my left shoulder, I remember, and said to the projectionist, hey man, you've got the wrong picture up on the left, because I'd always felt God was really fortunate to have me on his team because of my leadership in the church, the Bible study at our house, what I was doing professionally. And that light just spoke, and it said, that's you. And suddenly I looked back over here at this black screen, and I could just see my whole life basically in review. I could see everything I did, and it was, I was just self-centered. I wasn't loving. Everything I did was about performing. but it was always self-serving. And that's when I figured out that being a bad, having a fear of being a disappointment, made everything about me. It made me 100% totally self-centered. It may have made me look good, but in reality, if you're thinking about other people, trying not to disappoint them, and you're thinking about what they're thinking about you, then you're still thinking about you, even when you're thinking about them. And I just saw that my life didn't have love. And so at first I'm horrified when I look at this. It's just almost too much to bear, seeing all of that. And then I just moved into pure terror, because it dawned on me that this was judgment. And I had somehow stroked out in that room upstairs, and this was judgment. I had just been found wanting, and I was on the way down. And yet, that love was still just permeating me. I could just feel it, and I just felt and heard this voice going, "And I love you. Don't you get it? I just love you. Yeah, that's not good, but I love you. I just love you." And over again, it just kept saying, "I love you." And for some reason, for me, I don't know about you, but I thought if anybody really knew me, there was no way they could ever really love me. And I just began absolutely to weep, because I just couldn't believe this love that was enveloping me. In fact, I'm not even sure I could have looked and been able to see what that was if that love hadn't been holding me, because it was just too horrific. And then I find myself back in this lecture on covenant, and I have Stephanie over on my left. I remember that. And I had my affair partner, she was sitting on the right. And as I'm crying there, I just asked God at that moment, I said, "What do you want from me? Literally, what do you want?" And I just heard him say clearly, "I want you to be honest. I just want you to be honest with your wife and with your best friend." And I said, "Well, you've got to be kidding me." So what I did when this guy that was speaking was done, I literally went and asked if we could talk. And I told him about my affair. I didn't tell him about all the other acting out I'd done previously in the relationship. I mean, in some ways, I think the affair was, for me at least, just a part, like the tip of the iceberg. And the first question he asked me was, "What's God telling you?" And his name was Don. And Don said, and I said, "Well, he's telling me that I should be honest with Stephanie and with my best friend, but that doesn't make sense to me, because why in the world should they be hurt because of what I've done?" And Don just said, "Well, if God said it, why does it need to make sense to you?" And that actually made sense. And ever since that point in time, typically when I talk to someone like you, I ask the question, "What's God telling you?" Because I find that to be one of the most relevant questions. Whether you're agnostic, whether you're atheist, whether you're Buddhist, it wouldn't make any difference. I'd still ask the same question, because that to me is the most relevant question. What's in your heart, at least? And what I've discovered is oftentimes when people come to see me as a therapist, I think they're hoping that maybe I'll tell them something different than they already know. So that's, to me, why it's the relevant question, because if you already know the answer, you don't need me or anyone else to be telling you ultimately what you need to do. I mean, we all know what love is, and we know what's right. And so once he said, "Why does it need to make sense to you?" And I thought, well, that makes sense. He said, "Would you like some advice?" And I said, "I'm real open to advice right now, because, guys, y'all don't know Stephanie, but she is stronger than an acre of garlic. And I knew that she would literally, as I say, kick me through the goalpost of life. I mean, she would have no trouble leaving me. I knew she would divorce me, that this would be the deal breaker. And he asked, he said, what's the consequence of sin? And I said, well, that would be death, theologically. And he said, right. So anything she does short of killing you is really going to be mercy, right? You're not going to get what you deserve. And I went, wow. Anything short of death is really mercy. And I thought, that's kind of sick, but it makes sense. I'm really not going to get what I deserve. Really, regardless of what happens, it's less than that. I decided not to tell her that night because we were still sharing a room with the other couple, and that really felt awkward. I knew, for me at least, that there was no way I could talk to the other woman because I had tried that before. I knew that if I spoke to her, there's no way I would tell Stephanie. So the next day, I just waited until we left. I decided that when my front tires hit the street as we drove out the driveway, I would tell her. And sure enough, we hit that pavement, and I said, I've got something to tell you. I'm having an affair with your best friend. And I remember it was a blizzard that night. So I knew Stephanie, and we were driving out of the mountains, I knew Stephanie wouldn't be able to jump out of the car. She was stuck with me, and we started from there.
Well, I was in shock because I thought he was kidding, and I thought it was a pretty cruel joke, but I couldn't believe it because in my mind, I had him on such a pedestal that if someone were to have asked me, I would have said, well, if anybody was going to be unfaithful, it'd be me. I mean, because I just felt like he was such a godly person and had such a walk with the Lord that would just be nothing he ever entertained. Bear in mind, I knew nothing about any of the other issues like the masturbation I knew nothing about any of that. So I just felt like he was about as close to perfect as somebody could get. I mean, that had a lot to do with why I married him. And so I believe I said to you, you're kidding. And then it all started to make sense. Everything that I had seen, everything I had observed, and that I had questioned, that all made sense. And so in a way, there was a little bit of a relief that I'm not losing my mind. I wasn't going crazy. It wasn't my imagination, which is what he would always tell me. That's just your imagination. And I thought, I am going crazy. It wasn't. You might have felt like that too. You know, you see things and it just doesn't line up, and it's like a little bit of a red flag, but yet when you question about it, it's like, oh, no, it's just your imagination. What are you talking about? And so it was a relief to know that I hadn't been crazy. And so I just wanted to know when and where and how long and why, and I think I was really in shock. And of course the weather was bad, so it was hard. It was kind of difficult to have what you would consider a really good conversation because he was having to pay attention to the road a lot, and to have that emotional conversation was difficult. I remember just being quiet a lot too, just not knowing what to ask, or not even knowing what information was I interested in. And I don't remember if I asked, do you want a divorce or do you want to be with her? I don't think I asked those questions. I was just more asking about the actual affair. And I didn't ask any kind of details at that time other than where did it take place and how did you do that? I mean, how did you do that and work and be a husband? You know, I couldn't quite imagine how you fit that all into daily life. And I was angry. But I still think I was in too much shock to be very angry. It just seemed totally surreal. And it was dark, it was nighttime, and I don't think that well at night. After it's dark, everything seems a lot more complicated, and it seems much more bleak. So I kept thinking, we'll be home soon. I'm just going to go to sleep, and I'll wake up, and it will have been a bad dream. It will have been a nightmare. I'm sure that I'm going to go to sleep and wake up, and all this will be just something that I dreamed the night before. So I couldn't wait to get home. I was really eager to get home. And Rick seemed rather, I won't say lighthearted, but he did seem to be relieved. I could tell that it was something that was good to get off his chest. And I kind of resented that.
And I was absolutely doing my best to answer her questions, to tell her everything. It's just there was a lot to tell her. But I do remember feeling relieved, like you said. And when we got home, I went straight to sleep. And probably some of the best sleep I'd had for a long time.
Well, I lay there in bed. I couldn't go to sleep. And I got up and read my Bible, and I didn't even know what to read. You know, I thought, well, I can read about David and Bathsheba, but that didn't end so well. So I read some Psalms. I just kind of paced. And you could feel that the shift of this load had gone from him to me. And so he was sleeping like a baby, and I couldn't go to sleep. And I wanted to go to sleep so bad because I was just convinced that going to sleep and then waking up, it would all be better because it would all be a dream. And so I was finally able to go to sleep.
I remember the next morning.
You don't remember the next morning? I do, because we had our daughter, our oldest daughter, which was the only child we had, she stayed with a friend, and I had to go and pick her up. And I didn't want her to see me crying. I mean, she was just 2, but still, I didn't want to see her. And I certainly didn't want the friend that was keeping her to see me in anguish. So I managed to put on a semi-happy face. And then I went to the bookstore because I wanted to find some books on infidelity, of which there was one book. That's 31 years ago. There was not much in the market at that time.
I remember you telling me at that point you felt a lot of shame just being in there because
I was totally totally embarrassed. And so when the lady asked me what she could help me with, I just said, books on marriage. I wasn't about to say, my husband just told me he had an affair with my best friend. You have anything for that? So she showed me where the marriage shelf was, and now it's just a joke because the bookcase had a shelf about like this that had marriage books on it. And now, the whole side of a store can be devoted to books on marriage. So it was pretty limited, but I'm an avid reader, and I was convinced that there were some things out there that I could read. So I bought 2 books, and I came home and I started reading them and highlighting things in them. And then Rick would read them and he would highlight. So, then we could talk about what we had read. And that was very therapeutic. So it's kind of self-counseling because there wasn't.
Yeah, we went to talk to a few people, but they had no earthly idea what to say.
They would pray with us, but they really didn't know what to do with us.
And I was actually a marriage and family therapist. I mean, I knew the community in Denver and Boulder, and I didn't know anybody that knew what to do. And in that initial phase, I don't know about you, but it was chaotic. I did realize that this whole thing of being up a bad, having this fear of being a disappointment, was really going to be my biggest barrier. I felt like God showed that to me. And I actually told Stephanie that my focus couldn't be trying to save this relationship. Because if what I wanted to do was save the marriage at this point, it wasn't going to be pragmatically smart for me to be honest and tell her everything I had yet to tell her, or do what I felt like I needed to do to recover. And I'm sure as you watch this, there's a part of you, if you've been unfaithful like I've been, that is literally torn, because it feels the more information you give, if what you want is the marriage, the less the probability of your relationship being able to work out.
And for me that was hard because it let me know that the marriage was not number one. And I wanted it to be, but yet I didn't want it to be, because I really wanted you to get your relationship with the Lord right first, because I knew if that was not right, then you couldn't be a husband in the kind of marriage that I thought I had.
Well, and I knew that if there wasn't a God, that I was in trouble, because I had done everything I could possibly think of to control this. And like it says in the first step, my life was completely unmanageable, and I was completely powerless over it. So again, if there wasn't a God, I was in trouble. I didn't see any way that I would ever stop this. And so that became my constant pursuit. And certainly it wasn't that I didn't want you to heal. I mean, I answered all of her questions. I was there. I listened. One other piece of advice that Don had given me was never be defensive. And I worked really, really hard at not being defensive. And at night we would sit down and talk. And she saw me reading my Bible. She saw me studying. She saw me working, trying to be honest. One of the really difficult pieces of my own personal recovery at that point was dealing with my family. Not only had I always been trying to please Stephanie, but I'd also been trying to please my family. And I remember the first person Stephanie told after this came out, I don't know who the first person you might have told was, but the first person she told was my mother.
I don't recommend that. But his mom was she was my best friend. And my other best friend had betrayed me. So, you know, I didn't have anybody to talk to. And you had already talked to Don. And I sort of felt like Don was your confidant. And I didn't have anybody. And I just needed somebody to just tell me that it's going to be okay. You can survive this. And even though your mom hadn't been through it or anything like that, and she wasn't even able to tell me that, but she just listened and she was sympathetic. But that, you know, I regret having done that.
Right. And I think the next most difficult person to talk to was my father, who is where a lot of my issues had begun. Dad was very authoritarian, and we all lived trying not to disappoint Dad. So when I called him and talked to him about this, I think it was the first time I took really personal authority for my own life. At that point, I knew I was going to live and do what God wanted me to do. I was going to live for God. I wasn't going to try to please or live for Dad or even live for Stephanie in that sense. It was time for me to grow up and to have a voice, because being a Fabad, I'd always been trying to make her happy. But the more I tried to make her happy or tried to make my father happy, the more resentful I became. The more resentful I became, the more I was apt to work out or act out. So I knew it began with just being honest and having my own voice and expressing my own opinion and being who God made me to be, rather than compromising myself continually, trying to keep the peace, because I was conflict avoidant, and obviously I was very intimate avoidant. I remember after telling Dad that I just literally went in the backyard and cried. It was like the last piece of that image that I had been holding on to was completely gone. And the sad thing about what I did, because it was involving our small group, it was involving our church, it was involving pretty much our entire community, we lost, well actually Stephanie lost everybody. It was like the other couples all sided with the other woman. I certainly wasn't going back to that church. And in fact, I told Stephanie I didn't know where I was going to go to church. I needed to start searching, and she could come along if she wanted. But I just knew, again, I was finally being honest. I had to do what was going to work for me, and I really did hope it would be something that would be good for her. But right now, I had to heal, or I could never really be a good husband for her. A month into it, we go to a spiritual renewal conference in Nashville, and we're going to stay with Don, the first man I talked to. And when we got there, Don said to me, the guy that was leading this conference, Jamie, he thought Jamie had been in a similar situation as I had, and he suggested I talk to Jamie. And I said, you want me to go up to this guy leading a conference with over 1,000 people and tell him, I hear you cheated on your wife. And Stephanie actually thought this was a really good idea. I mean, maybe your wife has thought, or your husband, that there would be a good idea to talk to some people. And I was kind of mortified. So I said, if I see him alone, I'll talk to him. I agreed to that finally, because it seemed ridiculous to try to say that in front of other people. I was really ashamed in that sense. We skip one session and go out on the campus, and there's Jamie and his wife Jackie sitting in a gazebo all by themselves. And Stephanie's all excited, and she grabs my hand and drags me over there. And I remember saying to Jamie as we sat down, I hear we might have something in common. And he just said, what's that? And I said, well, I've been unfaithful to my wife. And he said, yeah, I was unfaithful to Jackie. And just out of concern, he said to us, what have you guys done? And I told him about the one book we'd found, Myth of the Greener Grass, and that there was a chapter in there called The Anatomy of an Affair, where the guy's story was my story. That, you know, it was the one thing that gave me hope, because I found out I wasn't the only one. And I remember Jamie saying, yeah, that's my story. And I said, yeah, that's my story. And he said, no, Rick, that's my story. Peterson came and interviewed me, and that's my story in the book. And at that moment, I was stunned. I couldn't believe that I'd traveled from Denver, Colorado, met a guy from Florida on a gazebo on the Belmont campus in Nashville, whose story I'd read about and who was just like me. I thought, what are the probabilities? But it was just coincidences like that that began to help me see that the hand of God was moving. And again, I would just say to those of you going through this, if you really look, I bet you see instances where little things happen that you go, I can't believe that. Even being here at a Fair Recovery, I suspect you'll hear things that you go, wow, I'm not alone. And at that point, they began to share their story and what had happened. And I think it was hearing, I know it was hearing what they said that began to give both of us hope that it was possible to ultimately work through this thing. And they actually stayed in touch some with us afterwards, and they mentored us, and that was a phenomenal blessing for us. If it hadn't been, I think, for finding them, getting some very sound advice from other people who had gone through this, we probably, even if we'd stayed together, I think we'd still be limping. I don't think we knew how to heal. And it was through that we began to just slowly move forward. It was talking to those people who had been there and who were willing to stand with us and who were judgmental. Stephanie had probably 2 or 3 women that she hooked up with that we found to be really important.
One of the things that you did that was very helpful for me was you quickly approached someone about just getting together with them once a week and talking about what's going on in their life. You know, I don't even think you called it accountability, but that's what we would call it today. I think you just called it getting together.
Yeah, and Phil and I talked literally every day.
And there was another guy too who had been in seminary.
Right, and one of the guys had kind of been in recovery and had done recovery work, and that was important.
When you would do those things that were reassuring to me and that were, in essence, rebuilding trust, such as getting together for coffee with your friend, or early in the morning you'd be spending time in your Bible, or just things like that, I was able to see those as something that you were doing not in a manipulative manner, that you were doing those because you knew that you had to do that for you. In addition to your being in an accountability relationship with someone, was just the fact that every day you would talk to me about your struggles that day, the temptations that you had faced, and just what went on at work. And as painful as that was, it was still something that was good for me because you were being transparent. You weren't just keeping it inside and definitely weren't acting on it. And so I think it caused you to be hypervigilant about just how you handled yourself. And that was reassuring to me.
For me, that one word, being honest, was absolutely critical. I was going to be honest regardless of what it was. And so I did start sharing all my struggles. And knowing that I was going to share things at the end of the day was also a great inhibitor. Now, the other thing it did for me is knowing I was going to share with Stephanie, I started really setting up strong boundaries in my life because I didn't want triggers that would then create situations that I had to share with Stephanie. And so I quit reading magazines, newspapers. I quit watching television.
Yeah, we didn't watch any movies that had anything to do with sex or infidelity, which meant really we didn't watch anything,
So in a way that really began to help. First off, for Stephanie, I think it eliminated a lot of triggers and just the changes she saw in me. And I wasn't doing this for Stephanie. I was doing this because I was sick of who I was. I did not want to be that person anymore. And it wasn't about, again, pleasing her. Now, I was concerned about all of her pain and her triggers, and if she was upset, honestly, and again, I'm not saying I'm this great guy. I mean, I think this was probably just a God thing, but I'd ask her, what's going on? And then I'd let her talk. And at night, I remember she would ask me, how was your day? And that one question, how was your day, was really her cue for, I'm ready to hear where you struggled today. I really want to know. And then she would talk to me about where she struggled. Learning to be honest and intimate was really difficult. Intimacy inside a marriage, 2/3 of the time, it creates a short-term instability because she was hearing things that I would never let her see before.
And it was painful. It was painful. But it was kind of like, I knew that had to happen because I knew that until he could do those things, I could never really trust him again. And so I would just kind of, during the day, that self-talk of knowing that I had to be ready, that when I asked him that question, that I was then saying, okay, emotionally I'm ready. And there were times that I would get upset and cry, but I didn't want to, and I would tell him, this doesn't mean I don't want you to do it. I know this is something that is necessary. I know it's something that in the long run will be meaningful for our marriage.
And I don't advise that for a long period of time, sharing temptation, sharing kind of struggles, I don't think that's healthy for a relationship. I don't think your mate can ultimately be an accountability partner. But in the beginning, that whole thing of being honest was critical. I really couldn't hide anymore, and I had to learn to be honest. And what that allowed for the two of us was a phenomenal amount of connection. I think our intimacy level in the marriage, because I was such a pretender, was probably only about a 2 to 3 on a scale of 1 to 10, because she had no idea who I was.
I just thought he was who he was. I thought that I knew who he was, and I thought there was nothing underneath the surface that I even needed to be trying to pull out.
Once I began sharing those things, our intimacy level probably went to an 8 or a 9.
Oh yeah, it was huge.
One thing that happened, I don't remember exactly how long after telling Stephanie, it was the first time we were ever sexual again. I really wasn't sure whether we would ever have sex again, but that was probably one of the most significant events for me in that recovery process. Largely because, as an addict, I had never understood what I think lovemaking had been about. To me, it had always been about orgasms, and I'd used a lot of fantasy when we'd made love, at least me personally, because it was never about Stephanie. It was about me getting aroused and having a great orgasm. And for the first time when we made love, it was astounding. I didn't even know what that was. I was shocked because it was about her. And that's when I learned that you can never be loved unconditionally as long as you only conditionally let someone know who you are. And I'd never let Stephanie know me. And so it always seemed fake when we'd be together because I thought, she could never love me. But suddenly she did know all of me, and she loved me. And the difference that made for me, it changed everything. And I think for the first time, I understood what it was like to be loved. And I know that may sound really paradoxical, but that was a huge moment for me. Now, in her healing, I will say, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's not the same for you, that wasn't just a consistent piece that happened after that. There were moments when she just really was not interested in any way, shape, form, or fashion of being with me. And so there were long dry spells, and that was fine. I mean, I wasn't expecting anything. I knew that it wasn't a time for me to be pressing that particular issue. I knew there would be moments when she really wanted to be with me, and there were other moments it was still way too much pain. But that also certainly worked itself out and changed everything for the two of us. In the long run, that got much better than it had ever been before. And there were things that in my life had been tied to behaviors with my affair partner. And those were also triggers for Stephanie, such as my music, my guitar, which had always been a very, very important part of my life, running. And those were things that I stopped for two reasons. One, I knew that they were hard for her, but two, they were huge triggers for me. Even music that I listened to was a huge trigger that kept me connected back to my affair partner. So eliminating as many of those things as possible, that was a huge step for me, beginning to disconnect, because disconnecting from her was a difficult thing because we had become so entangled. In fact, shortly into recovery, she actually called me one day at work, and I hadn't spoken to her since all of this began. In fact, as the story goes, after I told Don, and after we left that next night, they weren't leaving till the next day, and Don had gone to her and said, Rick's going to tell Stephanie the story, and I think it would probably be a good idea for you to tell your husband, because I think he's also going to make amends to your husband. Now, I don't recommend talking to the spouse of an affair partner all the time. In fact, rarely do I recommend that. But in this situation, this is my best friend. I mean, we are so entangled with this couple. There was no way that this wasn't going to ultimately come out. There was just, the relationships are too close. And so in situations like that, I do think there has to be a conversation. I think it's really healthy to have that conversation. We were even so close, we were in their will, for instance, to take their children if something happened to them. So just to let you know exactly why. But she called me at work, even though I'd never spoken to her, because I knew if I spoke to her that I would get sucked back into that relationship. And I remember her saying, as I picked up the phone, no caller ID back in those days, hi, and I recognized her voice, and I just said, I can't talk to you, and I'm fixing to call Stephanie and tell Stephanie that you called, and I'm fixing to call your husband and let him know that you called. And then I just hung up the phone, and I didn't let her say another word, because I knew if she said anything else that I'd be gone. There's no way that I'd be able to stay out of the relationship. And that was one of the more difficult things I've ever done in life, because I felt really bad about what I'd done to her. It had been painful not continuing that relationship, and that was the last time she contacted me. And I think that was a really critical time, because if I hadn't done that, I believe she would have continued to pursue. I would have been at risk of pursuing, but by making that one decision and ending it that way, that was the thing, at least for me, that put an end to that relationship. And again, being transparent with Stephanie about the contact was absolutely critical, because I knew whether or not my marriage made it, I wasn't going to go back into deception. I mean, honesty was still the primary goal in my relationship with God and doing what I felt He was calling me to. When all of this happened, I was a marriage and family therapist, which, as I look at that, it seemed pretty hypocritical. I wasn't somebody that was building marriages. I was somebody who was destroying marriages. And I really wanted a career change. In fact, for me, not only did I want a career change, I thought it'd be a good idea if we could even get out of Denver, because since they were so close to us, even the neighborhood, everywhere we lived, was a huge trigger. And I remember Steph and I just began to pray that there would be an opportunity for something different. 9 months after discovery, we actually were able to move from Denver to Austin. And that's something I know that helped us. I'm not saying that everybody needs to move, everybody needs to change professions. It was just, in my situation, important, not because of the people I was working with or anything like that. It was just what I was doing professionally wasn't what I needed to be doing at that time. And that was a good move. And I find that while those are really scary things, they're also things that we did jointly that helped create connection. That was an important thing for us.
Yes, it was.
I got involved with a good group of guys, and I really continued in my recovery. But in all honesty, for me, I never fully accepted the magnitude of the issues I had. In recovery work, they say once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. Once a sex addict, always a sex addict. I remember 5 years into recovery, much of the activity I'd been involved with, I'd cut out, because I really didn't think I needed it anymore. In fact, I didn't even think I had a problem anymore. As I tell this, I don't want to freak everybody out, but I want to say there is not too much you can do. And it's important, and I think I said this from the beginning, I was not doing this because Stephanie wanted me to do things. I was doing this because I wanted to be a different person, and I didn't like who I had become. I think if I'd done it for Stephanie, there's no way I would have continued in my efforts. As long as I wanted the marriage, I would have had the motivation to do the work. But at some point, when she had really made me angry, I'd no longer have the motivation. So at least one of the things I discovered is that doing it for me was critical. And at least accepting that I needed to do it was critical. But I didn't fully embrace the magnitude of my issues. And so 5 years into recovery, things had gotten very, very bad in the home building business. The banks had failed. It was in the late 80s, and we had actually gone bankrupt. And in all of that stress, I began falling back into my patterns. It started very small at first. In recovery work, they say one drink is too many, 500's not enough. Well, once I took that first little step, I started that entire ritual and routine. Again, a caveat, not everybody that goes through a fair recovery is an addict, but I am. And if you are, I hope you can at least accept that. As we always say, if you can't accept where you're at, you'll never get to where you're going, and that was where I was at. As I slowly began falling back into my old patterns, I started talking to the guys I was in relationship with. I was doing everything I could to stop it. And it was so infuriating. I just continued right down that path. And the one thing I knew that I needed to do was tell Stephanie. But there was no way I was going to tell Stephanie because I had so much pride. I mean, it was stupid enough to do all of these things to begin with, but to do it again was like You had to be an absolute idiot, especially after, you can imagine, I had said, I won't ever do this again. There's no way I'll do this again. Of course, I hadn't realized, I said that on my wedding day too, and had still managed to do it. I don't know why I thought that I could say it, after my first discovery and think I wouldn't be able to get back there again. And I came to a point in this slide, and it had gone on for 6 months. I hadn't gotten fully involved with another person. It would have just been a matter of time. It was like one of those cartoon characters, sliding down the roof with your fingernails. I just couldn't stop the momentum. Stephanie asked me, I remember, what happened? It was like in a car wreck when everything goes into slow motion. And I went, I'm doing the same thing I did initially, completely. I'm trying to manage and control this thing, and I'm trying to somehow stop. This is the exact same thing. And the only way I was able to get out of this, the only way I was able to gain control was to give up complete control and to let go and to quit trying to save the marriage, which is what I was doing once again. And as I was thinking all that, and I'm sure it just took a second or two, like I said, it was all in slow motion, I thought, no, I want my life back. I'm sick of how I'm feeling, because I think the consequence of these behaviors is total misery. I was miserable, and I just thought, I've got to stop it. So I told her what was going on. And again, I assumed she would divorce me, because she told me that if I ever went back here again, that the marriage was absolutely over. But I'd already thought through this. And when I told her, again, I was like, I don't blame you if you want to divorce me. I'm not happy with me. I would divorce me. But I will tell you, I've got to live life differently. And you need to make a decision, again, whether or not you want to be with me. And so I began telling her things that I knew I would have to do for the rest of my life if I was going to stay safe for her. And I decided I didn't want to hurt her again. I just didn't. And I told her things like, if she didn't see me meeting with my groups, with guys, that she really needed to file for divorce. I probably wouldn't be acting out at that point when I quit doing my program, but I also knew it was only going to be a matter of time, because I could tell her that I was never going to do that again. But I knew finally that I would do it again if I didn't do the right things. And as I remember, it really didn't take us that long to work through that.
We had been doing very well in our marriage. I would say we were doing great. I was feeling really good about things. I was not feeling like there was any reason for me to be unusually concerned. And so when he came and told me what had happened, I was surprised. And I remember telling them, if you do this again, I'm not going to stick around. But this was not with an affair with an individual, which doesn't lessen the fact that it was infidelity. But I didn't feel that competition that I had felt before. When he told me he was extremely repentant and broken and already putting into place even more things that he felt like he needed to do to get back to the place he wanted to be. So it was, I hate to call it a bump in the road, but it was that in comparison to what we had gone through before. So it was, I think it was really a good learning experience for me, in that can happen. Relapses happen. Relapses happen in any addiction. And I think it's kind of like, because you've already been through experiencing it once, you know a little bit more about what to expect. So the second time it was hard, but it wasn't nearly what it was the first time.
All I can say is I want people to be doing what they need to do, those of you who have been unfaithful, for you. I want you to try at least to help your mate, but if it becomes about trying to please, again, we're going to have a problem in the long run. But be honest with yourself and try to accept who you are and recognize this isn't a bad thing. my program, the things I do, meeting with my guys, is absolutely the best part of my life. Well, I can say Stephanie's a really good part, but it's in the top two because I have real relationships and we have a blast together. And I would hope for those of you in recovery, you find that sort of community because it's the community that helps with that isolation. That was the thing that slowly began to pull me out of that and help me to keep my feet on the ground and help me to have people around me who could help me know whether or not I was thinking straight, that I could be honest with. Also, Stephanie knew that she didn't have to be an accountability partner. She knows as long as I'm with those guys, if I come to a place, if there's acting out behaviors, I'll let her know. But majority of the stuff that I struggle, in fact, all of the stuff I struggle with are the temptations or just thought process and we even talk about more than that. We talk about vision. We talk about how we're doing as husbands or how well we're living life. But those things she knows I handle over there so that we get to live a life that isn't rotating around this. Because I don't think it's healthy if your life rotates around recovery all the time. Recovery is just something that's integrated into my life so that she can be safe. But we have our life that really is a lot of fun.
It is. People ask me often about learning to trust Rick again, and when did that happen? How did it happen? And I think it looks different for different people. I had to decide how did that need to look to me. So I would suggest maybe that you think about that yourself. How does it need to look for you to start trusting your spouse again? And so that you can communicate that, and y'all can talk about it. One of the things that I noticed is that it's a lot like morning sickness, for me at least. I had lots of morning sickness, and it lasted all day long, seemed forever. And that's the way the infidelity was. It occupied like 99.9% of my thinking time. And then as I began to see things changing in Rick, and as I began to do things differently myself, I might notice that I'd gone an hour and I hadn't gotten upset about it. I hadn't thought about it. Then slowly I might notice that a day had gone by. Then it would be a couple of days, and before, as time went on, I might have 3 or 4 days in a row where I didn't think about it as much, and then bam, I'd have a day where I thought about it again. But with morning, if you had morning sickness and you remember how it gradually got a little bit better, and you'd have a day that you didn't have any, and then all of a sudden you had more of those in a row. So there began to be more good days than bad days. And I could relax more. I didn't feel like I had to be as constant. I felt like if I was thinking about it, he would be thinking about it too, and it would keep him on his toes. And I don't know where I got that idea, but that's just kind of how my brain worked. And I know it wasn't really true. But so I thought, as long as I'm thinking about it, I'm sure he's really thinking about it and being good. But time went on, and a normal routine developed. I had more days that we could talk about something else at the end of the day. Yeah. That was really a relief, to be able to talk about something besides the infidelity or things that would make me up. We could talk about something besides what upset me. And morning sickness, all of a sudden you will begin to notice that you've had a couple of weeks that you didn't have any nausea. And then, as months went by, then you would notice, I don't have it very often at all, unless maybe I take a prenatal vitamin on an empty stomach. So just every once in a while you would have triggers that would set things off after several months had gone by. But then an emotional time period could hit that I was really needy, and I would need his reassurance a lot. I would need him to talk to me about that things were going better for him, and when things were a little bit better for him, then I was able to let go more.
by the time we got to a year, things had gotten better, and then we hit that 1-year anniversary, and that was
kind of a setback.
That was a setback.
The date was a trigger.
Right.
Yeah.
That whole season, and because it's when she knew everything began, and she knew events that had occurred, and those triggered. At year 2, it wasn't nearly as bad. That 2-year point was absolutely critical, because at that point it certainly wasn't the main thing our life rotated around at all. Other things had come back into our life, and we were living a normal life. It was there. It might come up. But literally, to make the 2 years was amazing. And by 3, we were breathing. By 5, it was such a part of our history. And then you were talking about like 20 years?
Yeah, at 20 years, I was visiting with a friend, and we were talking about a friend of ours who she and her husband had separated because of infidelity. And I made the comment, I cannot imagine how she feels. And my friend looked at me and she said, "Sure you can." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I went through that too. Yeah, I can imagine how she feels." So I know that seems absolutely unbelievable, but you will get through it. And then we reached a point where Rick was starting to consider going back into marriage and family practice. I knew that when we moved to Austin and he went into business with his dad, I knew it was just an interim period. I knew that was really not his passion. And so I wasn't surprised when he wanted to go back into marriage and family, because I felt like I believed that was really God's calling on his life. And that was where he was going to be meeting needs the most. And that was also where he was going to feel fulfilled the most.
I think one of the cool things with Stephanie, too, was she really encouraged me in working through the area of infidelity.
Yes.
Because we really wanted to be able to use that.
We felt, from the time that it happened, we really felt like, and we had received some counsel from other people saying that they felt like this was an area that we were going to be working. And so I was excited about that possibility, because there still wasn't a lot out there. And I just felt like God had already brought some people into our lives that we had been able to spend time with and just have conversation about what was going on in their marriage. And several of those couples, it had come up that there was some infidelity. And so I felt like that was a call for us. And so it was exciting.
And I found that Stephanie probably did more than I did. I mean, I'm the one doing the therapy, but Stephanie was actually the receptionist for me back in those days.
Yeah, I was.
And so she was always the first line. And I've always said, people, once you go through this, God has no wasted motion. Mm-hmm. And people just show up on your doorstep. And they were calling.
Literally.
It wasn't that I was advertising we were trying to work with infidelity, but Stephanie was on the phone all day long, talking to people who'd been betrayed and were shattered. And
well, it was kind of like the first responder, because some people would call and they couldn't even talk. They would just cry. Back then, there was, many years ago, and so it was still a pretty new topic for people to call and really be honest about. And so for me to be able to say, "Hey, I know how you feel. I truly know how you feel because I've been there." That was, I thought, I knew how much that would have meant to me. If I could have just had someone who could, that I knew had gone through it, and I could listen to them, and I would feel like, "Oh, you're telling me truth. You're telling me things that I can count on." And so I thought, there's a need for that. There's just a need for someone who has walked that road to be able to compassionately and sincerely tell those people, "I know how you feel."
And with a fair recovery, which was a dream for both of us, we took the principles of what we went through. In the beginning, as people came into our life, the whole piece of community, and it was those concepts that we began using long before we actually established a fair recovery, where we began to see in the community how much it helped couples. That just treating a couple by me sitting down with them wasn't nearly as effective as doing a group and just going through a process. What I want from you hearing our story to know that there's a phenomenal amount of hope. And we always say there is such a high probability that your relationship can be so much better than it ever was before, that this can be a catalyst. So there's hope. Don't give up as you go through this program.
I had no idea when we went through our infidelity that anything positive could come from it. In fact, that was, survival was just all I had in mind. Just being able to survive, be a mom, be a wife, really just be a mom, because I didn't know how interested I was in being a wife. But it has been absolutely a ride to see how it has been used for good, and how much our marriage has improved and grown because of what we went through in our infidelity, but also because of what we have gone through with other couples in their infidelity. So it's very painful sometimes to sit in that room and listen to the stories and know that room is just bursting at the seams with pain. But at the same time, because we know the hope that's there, the hope that we have for you, that changes everything. And it makes it, what you're going through, we look at it, I look at it, it will become a thing of beauty. It really, really will be. And that's what I want to say to people. I just want you to hear that. It will be bad, and it will be hard. It will be painful, but you will get through it. You will definitely get through it. And on the other side of it, you'll be a stronger person.
On March 12th, 1984, when all of this came out, we never would have imagined at that point in time that what we went through would impact thousands of couples. But what we've learned as we've watched couples go through this is God has no wasted motion. He doesn't. And this is never a ministry, something you probably would have wanted or volunteered to be a part of. No. But we've seen time and time again that God doesn't have that wasted motion. He will take what you're going through, and He's going to use it in the long run. And others will come to you. So please understand that even though where you're at, it's horrible, you will also be a gift to other people as they go through this.